Some people become a neighborhood, not famous, not powerful, just the person everyone knows, the one whose porch light is always on, whose screen door you can hear 3 houses down, who has been part of the fabric of that block so long that the block would not make sense without her. Earline Strother was that person for 41 years. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, she came outside at 3 o'clock the way she always did, sat in her chair, watched the afternoon. The same porch, the same light, the same woman she had been every Tuesday for 4 decades. 2 officers drove past. They stopped. 11 minutes later, Earline Strother, 73 years old, was in handcuffs on her own porch in front of every neighbor who had ever known her name. The charge was disturbing the peace. She was sitting in a chair. What those 2 officers never thought to ask, never imagined they needed to, was who her son was. Her son was a federal investigator with the Department of Justice, and their department was already his case. They didn't stop a grandmother. They handed him the last piece of evidence he needed. If you've ever had to be twice as careful, twice as composed, twice as documented just to be treated like you belong, this channel is for you. Like this video, subscribe. And stay, because what Cornell Strother had already built before they touched his mother is the whole story. 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and the light on Earline Strother's block was the kind of light that only exists in autumn. Low and amber and unhurried. The kind that makes everything it touches look like it has always been exactly where it is and intends to stay. Earline came outside the way she always did, screen door closing behind her, with the specific sound that every neighbor on the block could identify without looking up. The chair was where it always was. She sat in it the way she always sat, not performing rest, not settling in for anything other than the afternoon itself, simply present on her own porch, the way a person is present in a place they have inhabited, long enough that the place has taken the shape of them. She had been doing this for 41 years. She was watching the afternoon when the patrol car slowed. It did not slow because something was happening. Nothing was happening. A 73-year-old woman was sitting in a chair on her own porch on a Tuesday afternoon in a neighborhood that knew her name, and a patrol car came down the block, and the officers inside it saw her sitting there, and something about her sitting there, still, unhurried, occupying her porch in the amber October light without apparent reason or destination, was enough. They stopped. Officer Wade Sutter got out first, his partner Dale Pressler behind him. They came up the front walk the way officers come up a front walk when they have already decided the walk is warranted and have not yet had to explain to themselves precisely why. They asked Earline what she was doing. She told them she lived there. No, they asked for identification. She reached into her pocket slowly, produced the card, held it out with her hand open and flat, not extended toward them like a plea, not pulled back like a challenge, simply available. The way you hold something out to someone when you have decided that the transaction is going to be completed correctly, and that your role in ensuring that is to give them nothing to respond to except the thing they asked for. They ran her name. It came back clean. It had always come back clean. They told her she was creating a public disturbance. She was sitting in a chair. 3 houses down, Doretha Mims was on her own porch. She had come outside 20 minutes before Earline. She was shelling butter beans into a pot she kept by the steps, the way she had been shelling butter beans on Tuesday afternoons since before some of the newer neighbors had moved onto the block. She heard the patrol car slow. She looked up. She set down the pot. She did not look away. What she saw, Earline's hand staying in her lap after she returned her ID. Open. Still. Not gripping the arms of the chair, not folded tight against her body, not doing any of the things hands do when fear is present and being managed. Just resting. The way hands rest when the person they belong to has decided that the only thing available to her in this moment is to be exactly and completely what she is, and that being exactly and completely what she is will have to be enough. Doretha watched them put the handcuffs on anyway. She watched them walk, Erline Strother, down the front steps of the house. Erline had lived in for 41 years. Past the garden Erline had planted, past the roses Erline's late husband had put in, along the walk that Erline had tended alone for 19 years since, and place her in the back of a patrol car on a Tuesday afternoon in October in front of everyone who had ever known her name. Doretha Mims did not go inside. She sat on her own porch in the amber light, and she waited, the way women who have been watching their neighborhood for 38 years wait when something has just happened that the neighborhood is going to need to answer. The block was very quiet. The screen door on Erline's porch had not closed yet. It was still open. The chair sat empty in the afternoon light. The file had been open on Cornell Strother's desk for 2 years. Not the same physical pages. Federal case files don't work that way. They grow. They expand. They become the kind of document that requires its own system of organization before they are anywhere near complete. But the thread that ran through all of it, the original document that had started everything, had been on his desk in one form or another. Since the Tuesday afternoon, he ran the first numbers and understood that what he was looking at was not noise. He worked the way federal investigators work, without urgency in the surface sense, with total urgency underneath it. Every document verified before it entered the file. Every data point cross-referenced before it was cited. See every pattern confirmed across enough incidents that no defense attorney could characterize it as coincidence or anomaly, or the inevitable variation of a large department doing complex work in a complicated city. He had been building this the way you build something designed to hold weight, slowly, with attention to every joint, with the understanding that the strength of the finished thing depends entirely on the care taken with each individual piece. 6 weeks before they put handcuffs on his mother, he was looking at their names: Wade Sutter, Dale Pressler. They had been in the file for 9 months, not as the primary subjects, not as the architects of what the file documented, but as 2 of the 14 officers whose patrol patterns in the 3 zip codes formed the statistical core of the enforcement case. While Cornell had not chosen them because they were exceptional, he had chosen them because they were representative, because their numbers looked like the department's numbers, which was the entire point, that this was not about 14 individual officers making individual bad decisions, but about a system that had produced the same decision across 14 officers and 31 months and thousands of stops, which meant the decision was not individual at all. He pulled up their patrol log for the 19th month and added it to the spreadsheet. 47 stops between them, in zip code 3 alone, over 19 months. He sat with that number for a moment before he typed it. Zip code 3 was not a number to Cornell Strother. It was his mother's porch at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was his grandmother's church on the corner of Delmar and 9th, the one with the green awning that had faded to the color of old money and that nobody had replaced because nobody wanted it replaced. It was the dry cleaner where he had taken his shirts in high school, the corner store that had changed owners 3 times but kept the same handwritten signs in the window because the neighborhood knew what they said. It was the specific sound of screen doors and butter beans and the amber light that came down that particular block in October like it had been arranged there. 47 times in 19 months, Sutter and Pressler had pulled up behind a car, or approached a doorway, or slowed in front of a porch in the zip code that contained all of it. He had chosen this case because he recognized the streets. He had never written that down. He entered the number. He cross-referenced it against the overtime logs. The correlation was not ambiguous. It had never been ambiguous. It had been the same story in every month, across 31 months, which was what made it a pattern rather than an incident and a federal case rather than a complaint. He pulled Haney's enforcement directives, never written as quotas, always communicated as expectations, always received as requirements by officers who understood that the space between those 3 words existed only on paper and not on a paycheck. The financial architecture of a department that had built its evaluation system on stops that were never supposed to be examined by someone who knew what he was looking at. He was 3 weeks from filing, on 2 years of careful construction, approaching the moment when it would stop being a file and become a federal case. When the thing he had been building in the specific silence of a man who does this work correctly would become the thing the department had to answer in public, in a courtroom, with everything he had documented across 26 months entered into a record that could not be managed or absorbed or made to disappear, the way 11 prior complaints had been managed and absorbed and made to disappear. He did not know that in 6 weeks before the filing, Wade Sutter and Dale Pressler were going to drive down his mother's block on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He did not know that 48 was coming. He closed the spreadsheet. He opened the next document. He went back to work with the total, unhurried urgency of a man who understood that the strength of what he was building depended entirely on the care taken with each individual piece, and that he was too close to the end to give anyone a thread to pull. The footage arrived at 10:19 p.m. Not through a request, not through the standard channels that would have taken a private attorney 6 weeks and 3 motions to open. Through Merritt Lowe, who made 2 calls from his personal cell phone on a Tuesday night, because there are moments when the chain of command is the correct instrument, and moments when it is the slow instrument. And Merritt Lowe had been doing this long enough to know the difference. Cornell opened the file. He watched it the first time as an investigator. He noted the timestamp, 1514. He noted the location, the 2800 block. Zip code 3. He noted the absence of a documented disturbance, no complainant identified, no incident log preceding the stop, no record of a call that would have directed the officers to that block at that hour. He noted the ID return, clean. He noted the elapsed time between the clean return and the application of restraints, 41 seconds. He noted that in those 41 seconds, the subject had made no aggressive movement, had not been asked to perform any action she failed to perform, had given the officers nothing that the footage could characterize as resistance or threat or cause. 3 violations, 4 minutes, all on the department's own camera, all in a zip code already in his case file, all conducted by officers already in his case file. He wrote it down. Every item. Numbered. The way he had been writing things down for 2 years, completely, without rushing, giving each notation the specific weight it deserved before moving to the next one. Then he watched it a second time. He did not write anything down during the second viewing. What the camera showed on the second viewing was the same thing it had shown on the first. The porch, the chair, the amber light still present at the edges of the frame because it had been 3 in the afternoon and October. His mother's hands in her lap, open, still, while Sutter stood in front of her and Pressler moved behind. The way she held out her ID with her hand flat and open, not extended like a plea, not pulled back like a challenge. The handcuffs going on. The walk down the front steps past the roses his father had planted along the walk that his mother had tended alone for 19 years since. He watched her go down those steps. He closed the laptop. He sat in his office on the 14th floor with the city outside the window and the closed laptop in front of him. For a period of time, he did not record because it was not something he was going to put in the file. He opened the laptop. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring. She told him she was fine. She told him she had made dinner, collard greens, cornbread, the things she made when she needed her hands to be doing something that mattered. She asked if he had eaten. He told her he had. He had not eaten since noon. He was not going to tell her that. She told him, "Finish it the way you were going to finish it, not because of me. For the people on that block who don't have a son with a federal badge." He told her he would. He told her he loved her. He set the phone down. He opened the footage again, and he watched it as an investigator. That was what he told himself. Evidence, documentation. 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a body camera recording that was going to enter a federal filing as Exhibit A in a case he had been building for 2 years. He watched it 4 more times. He wrote nothing else down. He did not need to. He had been carrying zip code 3 for 2 years without putting it in the file. He knew how to hold the thing that was not going in the file. He had been doing it since the first Tuesday afternoon he ran the numbers and recognized the streets. He closed the laptop. He went back to work. The collard greens were still warm on his mother's stove 3 miles away. He did not know that. She had made enough for 2. The number that started everything was 4. Not a dramatic number. Not a number that announces itself. Just 4. The ratio of black residents stopped to white residents stopped for identical behavior across 31 months in 3 zip codes. Cornell had run the calculation on a Wednesday morning 18 months before they put handcuffs on his mother, and he had sat with it the way you sit, with something that confirms what you already knew but had not yet been able to prove. 4 times. Same behavior, same street. Different outcome depending on who was sitting in the chair. He had been a federal investigator for 11 years. He had worked cases that produced numbers like that before. He had learned, across 11 years, how to receive a number like that as data, to let it be what it was, a ratio, a pattern, through a measurable disparity that existed in a spreadsheet and would eventually exist in a federal filing, without letting it become something else, without letting it become personal. The work required that distance. The work required that you see the number before you see the street. 18 months before the arrest, Cornell Strother saw the street before he finished reading the number, because the street was Delmar Avenue, and Delmar Avenue was zip code 3. And zip code 3 was the block where he had grown up, where his mother's screen door made a sound every neighbor could identify without looking up, where his grandmother's church sat on the corner with the green awning that had faded to the color of old money, where the corner store kept the same handwritten signs in the window because the neighborhood knew what they said and nobody needed them to be new. He did not write that down. He never wrote that down. What he wrote down was this. Across 31 months, the department's own citation records showed black residents in 3 zip codes being stopped at 4 times the rate of white residents for behaviors documented identically in the stop reports. Sitting in parked cars, walking after dark, standing in front of buildings, existing on porches in the afternoon light. The behaviors were identical. The documentation was identical. The outcome was not identical. And the gap between identical behavior and non-identical outcome, sustained across 31 months and thousands of individual stops, and was not a gap that could be attributed to individual officer discretion. It was a gap that had been produced by something consistent, something systemic, something that had been communicating the same instruction to 14 different officers across 3 years without ever putting that instruction in writing. Captain Burl Haney had never written the instruction down. He had not needed to. Cornell found it in the overtime records. The same place had always lived in departments that ran this way, because the paycheck is the one document that tells the truth when everything else is written to avoid it. Officers whose stop numbers in the 3 zip codes exceeded the monthly threshold logged an average of 9 hours of overtime. Officers whose numbers fell below it logged an average of 2. The threshold was never named in any policy document. It did not need to be named. 9 hours and 2 hours, named it every 2 weeks, with the precision of a system that had been running long enough to become invisible to the people inside it. Haney's enforcement directives called it heightened community engagement. The overtime records called it 9 hours. Cornell built the financial architecture the way he built everything, completely without rushing, giving each layer the specific documentation it needed before moving to the next. The overtime budget, $3.8 million annually. The percentage generated by stops in the 3 zip codes, 61%. The percentage of those stops resulting in charges, 31%. The percentage of those charges that survived prosecution, 14%. A department spending $2.3 million a year generating stops that produced charges, that produced convictions, at 14%. Not because the officers were ineffective, but because the stops were never about conviction. They were about presence, about the specific, sustained communication to a neighborhood that it was being watched, that its porches and its parked cars and its evening walks were under a scrutiny that the neighborhood 2 zip codes over wasn't under and had never been under. Cornell had grown up in that neighborhood. He knew what being watched felt like from the inside. He knew what it cost, not in dollars, in the specific tax it placed on ordinary life, on the Tuesday afternoon on a porch, on the walk to the corner store, on the quality of ease that a person is supposed to be able to carry in their own neighborhood, and that this department had been systematically, measurably, documentably removing for 31 months. He had not chosen this case because the numbers were compelling. He had chosen it because he knew what the numbers were describing, because he had grown up inside what the numbers were describing, because the address on line 47 of Sutter and Pressler's patrol log was 3 houses from his mother's front porch, and he had ridden his bicycle past it every day for 18 years before he left for college, and he knew the family that lived there, and he knew that the stop on line 47 was not a data point. It was a neighbor. He had never written that down either. He closed the overtime file, he opened the next document, and he went back to work. The way he always went back to work, with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who understood that the distance between personal and professional was not a wall he had built to protect himself. It was the case he was building to protect everyone else. Cornell had been watching Theron Kipp for 4 months before he made contact. That was the work, the part nobody sees, the part that happens before anything happens. You do not approach a source inside a department you are investigating the way you approach a witness on the street. You watch first. You learn the shape of a person before you ask anything of them. You learn whether what you are seeing is conscience or calculation, whether the distance they are keeping from the people around them is the distance of a man who disagrees or the distance of a man who is waiting for the right moment to make disagreement profitable. Cornell had spent 4 months learning the shape of Theron Kipp. What he found was neither of those things. What he found was a man who had been paying attention for a long time and had nowhere to put what he knew. Kipp had 14 years on the force. He was not a crusader. Cornell had not been looking for a crusader. Crusaders made unreliable federal sources because their investment in the outcome was visible, and visibility gave defense attorneys something to argue. What Kipp was precise. He remembered things exactly. He had the specific memory of a man who had understood early in his career that the gap between what was said in a room and what was written about the room was where the real information lived, and who had been quietly, consistently filing that gap in his own memory for 14 years, without knowing who he was eventually going to give it to. Cornell made contact on a Thursday afternoon in a parking garage 3 miles from the department. He did not ask Kipp why he was willing to talk. Federal investigators do not ask their sources to justify their conscience, partly because the answer is rarely simple enough to be useful, and partly because asking the question changes the nature of what is being offered. A man who has to explain why he is doing the right thing is a man who has been asked to perform his own integrity, and performance is not what Cornell needed. He needed the information. The information was what it was, regardless of what had produced it in Theron Kipp's particular life across 14 particular years. What Kipp had was not what Cornell already had. That was the first thing that became clear. Cornell had the numbers, the stops, the overtime correlation, the financial architecture of a department that had built its budget on enforcement that was never supposed to be examined. What Kipp had was the room, the specific language of the briefings that Haney ran on the last Thursday of every month, where the numbers were discussed in terms that never appeared in any official document, because Haney was a man who understood precisely what could be written down and what needed to remain in the air of a conference room and nowhere else. Kipp could put Cornell in that room. He had written nothing down at the time. Writing things down in a room like that was its own kind of visibility, and Kip was not a visible man. What he had written down was afterward, in his car, in the specific shorthand of a man transcribing memory before it softened. 14 months of last Thursday briefings. The phrases Haney used when the numbers were good. The phrases he used when they weren't. The specific words, presence, engagement, and community accountability that functioned as a vocabulary Haney had developed to communicate expectation without documentation, direction without evidence, a quota without a number that could be subpoenaed. Cornell listened for 2 hours. He asked clarifying questions. He did not react to anything Kip told him in a way that would tell Kip how significant it was. Because significance, communicated, changes what a source believes they have given you, and Cornell needed Kip to give him everything before either of them assessed the weight of any of it. When Kip finished, Cornell asked him one question. He asked if Kip would provide a sworn federal statement. Kip looked at him for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. There is a difference, and Cornell knew the difference, and he waded through it without moving. Then Kip said yes. He did not testify publicly. A sworn federal statement was what the case needed, and a sworn federal statement was what he provided, in a room with Cornell and a federal stenographer on a Friday morning, delivered with the same precision he had been applying to 14 years of last Thursday briefings, giving the federal record everything that Haney had believed was safe because it had only ever been spoken aloud. Haney had been careful about what he put in writing. He had not been careful about Theron Kip. Doretha Mims will tell you she is not a sentimental woman. She will tell you this the way people tell you things that are mostly true, with the particular confidence of someone who has tested the statement enough times to believe it, and not quite enough times to be certain. She does not keep photographs on the mantle. She does not talk about the old days, as though the old days were better, simply because they were old. She has lived on this block for 38 years, and she will tell you, if you ask, that she stayed not because of what the block was, but because of what it was still becoming. Because leaving is a kind of conclusion, and Doretha Mims has never been interested in conclusions. What she is interested in is what is actually true, and what is actually true about this block she has watched for 38 years is not a sentiment. It is a record. She knew Erline Strother before Cornell was born, before the roses went in along the front walk, before Erline's husband Raymond planted them one spring weekend and stood back and looked at them with the satisfaction of a man who understood that planting something was a statement of intent about the future. Doretha had been 3 houses down for all of it, for Raymond's roses and Raymond's funeral, and the 19 years of Tuesday afternoons since when Erline had come outside at 3 o'clock and sat in her chair and watched the afternoon the way a woman watches an afternoon when she has earned the right to watch it in peace. She had watched this block through everything, through the years when the neighborhood thrived, when the businesses on Delmar were owned by the people who lived near Delmar, when the school 2 blocks over had the funding it needed, and the teachers stayed because staying was sustainable, when the block had the specific quality of ease that a community produces when it has been left alone long enough to become itself. And through the years when it didn't, when the funding left before the people did, when the businesses closed one by one with the particular silence of things that end not from failure but from abandonment, when the patrol cars started coming down the block with a frequency that had nothing to do with anything the block had done, and everything to do with a decision made in a building none of them had ever been invited into. And she had watched young men she knew by name get stopped on this street. Men she had watched grow up, had watched learn to ride bicycles in front of these same houses, had watched leave for college or for work or for the military, and come back with the specific dignity of people who had gone somewhere and returned with something. Stopped on a street that knew their names by officers who did not know their names and had not tried to learn them. Stopped for walking, for parking, for standing. For the specific crime of being present in a neighborhood that the city had decided required a level of scrutiny It did not apply to neighborhoods 2 zip codes over where the houses were newer and the porches were watched differently. She had never stopped watching either. That was the thing about Doretha Mims that the block understood, and that the rotating cast of officers never did, that the watching went in both directions. That 38 years of paying attention to a place produces a memory that is more complete and more accurate than any patrol log, because patrol logs record what officers decided to document. And Doretha recorded everything. Every face, every name, every Tuesday afternoon, every car that slowed when it didn't need to slow. She had been shelling butter beans when Sutter's car slowed on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She had set down the pot. She had watched every second of it. She had watched Erline hold out her ID with her hand, flat and open. She had watched the clean return register and the handcuffs go on anyway. She had watched them walk Erline down the front steps past Raymond's Roses and put her in the back of a patrol car in front of everyone who had ever known her name. She had not looked away. She has not stopped seeing it. Not because she is sentimental. She will tell you she is not sentimental. But because some things, once seen, become part of the record. And Doretha Mims has been keeping the record of this block for 38 years, with the precision of a woman who understood, long before anyone asked her to, that somebody needed to. The block needed a witness. It had always had one. It had just never needed her to testify before. Erling Strother was up at 5:30 the way she was always up at 5:30. This was the first thing. Not because she was performing normalcy. She was not a woman who performed anything. But because 5:30 was when she woke up, and the morning after her arrest on her own porch was still a morning, and she was still herself in it. She made coffee. She made it the way she always made it, in the same pot, measured the same way, because the coffee did not require her to have an opinion about what had happened yesterday, and she appreciated that about it. She sat at her kitchen table and drank it while the neighborhood was still quiet. She had been black in Atlanta for 73 years. She had been born in a city that had separate water fountains and had lived long enough to watch people argue about whether that history was relevant anymore. She had buried a husband and raised a son and taught Sunday school for 22 years and tended roses that someone else had planted and kept a porch that the whole block knew by the sound of its screen door. She had survived things that did not have names in the news, the accumulation of ordinary difficulty that black women of her generation carried not as trauma but as weather, the thing you dressed for and moved through and did not let stop you from getting where you were going. Yesterday was not the worst thing that had ever happened to Erline Strother. It was not even in the top 5. What it was clear. She knew exactly what had happened. She knew exactly why. Not she had known in the first 30 seconds, had known when Sutter came up the walk with the particular stride of a man who had already decided, before he reached the porch, what the porch contained. She had known when the clean return came back, and his hand moved anyway. She had felt the handcuffs go on with the specific clarity of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the shape of a wrong while it is still being committed. Not after, not in retrospect, but in the moment, which is the hardest kind of knowing because it leaves you nowhere to put your surprise. She had not been surprised. That was the thing she sat with at her kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning with her coffee. Not the arrest, the absence of surprise. The way it had felt in the moment the cuffs went on, like something that had always been a possibility on that porch. On any porch, on any Tuesday, in any amber October light. And that had finally arrived the way things arrive when you have been quietly prepared for them for 73 years without ever wanting to be. She called Cornell at 6:14, before he could call her. She knew he would have been awake since before she was. Knew he would have the footage, would have been watching it the way he watched everything, with that complete focused attention she had recognized in him since he was 9 years old, doing his homework at this same table. He answered before the first ring finished. She told him 3 things. The first, she was fine. Not performing fine. Not reassuring him out of habit. Actually fine. or in the specific way that a woman is fine when she knows who she is and what happened to her, has not changed either of those things. The second, he should not let this make him sloppy. She knew what the footage meant to the case. She knew what a mother's arrest meant to a son who had spent 2 years building something designed to be unassailable. She knew that the most dangerous thing that could happen to 2 years of careful work was a son who stopped being careful because he was angry. She was telling him before the anger told him something else. The third thing, she said slowly. In the voice she had used his whole life when she was giving him something that was meant to outlast the conversation. You finish it the way you were going to finish it. Not for me. For the people on that block who don't have a son with a federal badge. She let that sit. Then she asked if he had eaten. He told her he had. She knew he hadn't. She told him she was making breakfast and he could come by before work or she would be annoyed with him. And the specific way she said annoyed told him she loved him and she was proud of him, and she had known before he did that he was going to be the kind of man who spent 2 years building something like this, and that she had been preparing him for exactly that, since before he knew what preparation was. He said he would come by. He came by. She made eggs and biscuits, and did not mention the arrest again because she had said what needed to be said. And Erline Strother was not a woman who repeated herself. She watched him eat. She refilled his coffee without asking. When he left, she stood at the door and watched him walk to his car, the same way she had watched him walk to the school bus, to his first car, to the airport the morning he left for his first federal posting, with the particular gaze of a mother who is tracking not just where her child is going, but who he is while he goes there. He was who she raised him to be. That was enough. That had always been enough. She went back inside. She washed the dishes. She made her bed. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she came outside and sat in her chair on her porch in the amber October light. The same chair, the same porch, the same woman. Nobody stopped. It started with a public records request, not a tip, not a complaint that crossed his desk with someone's name on it and a story behind the name. A public records request that Cornell Strother filed on a Tuesday afternoon in November because the data was available, and he had learned, across 11 years of this work, that available data has a way of saying things that nobody intended it to say when they made it available. Citation records, 3 zip codes, 24 months, standard request. The kind he filed a dozen times a year on preliminary assessments that most often produced noise, the ordinary, unsurprising noise of a large department doing imperfect work in a complicated city. Nothing that rose to the level of pattern. Nothing that warranted the 2 years of work that a federal case required. He was not expecting anything different when he opened the file on a Tuesday afternoon. He ran the numbers the way he ran every preliminary analysis, quickly, methodically, without leaning toward any particular outcome, because leaning toward an outcome before the numbers were complete was how you found the case you were looking for rather than the case that was actually there. He had made that mistake once, in his second year, and had not made it again. He let the numbers be what they were. The numbers were not noise. He ran them again. Not because he doubted the first result. He doubted the first result because doubting the first result was the correct procedure, not because anything in it looked wrong. The second result was the same as the first. He ran a third pass with a different variable set. Same result. The pattern was in the data the way a bone is in a body, not on the surface, not announced, but structural, present in every direction you looked from, impossible to account for with anything except its own existence. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the numbers for a long time, and then he did the thing he had been trained not to do and had never fully stopped doing in 11 years of training himself, not to do it. He looked at the zip codes, not as numbers, as places. He knew zip code 3. He had known it since before he knew it had a number, had known it as the block, as the corner, as the sound of a screen door and the smell of his grandmother's kitchen, and the particular quality of amber light that came down Delmar Avenue in October, like it had been arranged there by someone who understood what that block needed. He knew the streets those citation records were describing. He knew the porches. He knew the people who sat on them. He did not write that down. He opened a new case file on his federal system. He moved the cursor to the top of the document where the case title went. He thought about what he was about to commit to. Not the work. He knew the work. 11 years had made the work familiar. But the specific gravity of opening a file on a department that patrolled the block where his mother came outside at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoons and sat in her chair and watched the afternoon in the amber light. He typed 3 words. The audience does not see them. They were for the file. They were for the 2 years that followed. They were for the Tuesday afternoon 26 months later, when a patrol car would slow in front of a porch and a 73-year-old woman would reach into her pocket and produce her ID with her hand flat and open and give 2 officers everything they asked for and nothing they could justify. He leaned back. He understood what he had just done with complete and unhurried clarity, that he had committed to something that was going to take everything careful and patient and precise he had, and produce something that would outlast the producing of it. He pulled the next document. He went back to work. It was a Tuesday. It was always a Tuesday. The best and the worst things in this story happened on Tuesdays. The day Cornell opened the file, the day they put handcuffs on his mother, or the day the federal charges dropped, and the department learned what a Tuesday 2 years earlier had been quietly becoming. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew the numbers, and the streets, and the porch 3 miles away where his mother would be sitting right now in the November afternoon light. The screen door closed behind her, watching the block the way she had watched it for 41 years. He did not call her. He went back to work. At 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in October, Erline Strother came outside. Same screen door, same sound, same chair in the same place it had always been. Same amber light coming down the block the way it came down every October, like it belonged there. Because it did. Because this block and this light had been in relationship for longer than anyone currently living on it could personally remember. She sat down. She was not making a statement. She was not performing defiance or recovery, or the particular resilience that people who have not lived her life tend to assign to black women who continue doing ordinary things after extraordinary wrongs. She was sitting on her porch at 3 o'clock because it was 3 o'clock, and this was her porch, and she had been doing this for 41 years, and she intended to do it for whatever years came after. Cornell had called that morning. He told her it was done. The federal charges, the consent decree, mandatory body camera retention, independent review of every stop and identify incident within 30 days of filing, an external audit of Haney's enforcement directives, every memo, every briefing record, every document in which the language of expectation had stood in for the language of instruction. All of it now in a federal record that could not be managed or absorbed or made to quietly disappear. Haney had retired before the audit began. He had not given interviews. There was nothing left for him to say that the audit would not say more precisely. Sutter and Pressler kept their positions. They were not the machine. They had been the machine's instruments, and instruments get restructured when the machine does. New supervisory framework, new evaluation metrics, a department now required to publish its stop demographics every quarter to a public that could read them. Whether they understood what the restructuring meant and whose Tuesday afternoon had made it necessary was their own work to do. Erline did not think about any of that sitting in her chair. She thought about what she had told her son the morning after. Finish it for the people who don't have a son with a federal badge. She thought about whether he had finished it that way. She believed he had. She had raised him to. And Erline Strother's belief in what she had raised her son to be was not a hope. It was an assessment. 3 houses down, Doretha Mims came outside with her pot of butter beans and set it by the steps the way she always did. She looked up. She saw Erline. She raised her hand. Erline raised hers back. They sat on their separate porches in the amber afternoon light, the way they had been sitting on their separate porches for 38 years. Two women on the same block, watching the same street, keeping the same record. Nothing dramatic, nothing performed. Just present, in the place that belonged to them, on a Tuesday afternoon in October. At 5:47, Erline went inside for dinner. The screen door closed behind her, with the sound every neighbor on the block could identify without looking up. The chair sat empty in the last of the light. Nobody came down that block who did not belong there. That was new. That was everything. Somewhere right now, there is an Erline on a porch. There is a Doretha watching. There is a Cornell building something nobody can see yet. Like this video, so more people find these stories. Share it with someone who needs to know they exist. Subscribe, because there is so much more coming, and it matters that you're here for it.